The Soul in the Shady Elm by Stanley Daniels. With free and easy stride, I soon left the hamlet far behind. Casting a contemptuous glance at the overcharged clouds above, I pressed my hands further into the depths of my greatcoat pockets. Did a storm threaten? What did I care? It was good, this pedestrian exercise. It was good, this damp air of the fall. I was breathing the air of a new freedom. Freedom from the terrifying results of shell shock. At last I had a grip on myself. There was determination in my set jaw now. Health fairly radiated from my spare frame. Vague anxiety and nervous trepidation were wraiths of the past and had long since been dismissed to the limbo of forgotten things. What foolish optimism I had then. Little did I dream of the weird and nerve-shattering adventure that awaited me that evening. A dreadful experience which sent tottering to ruin the walls of resurrected fortitude. A stranger in this wilderness of a country, I was indifferent to the geographical lay of my surroundings. Every road was a road to health because I could walk upon it and feel my strength growing. With a zest for living, I struck across country, leaving the level road for exercise of a more energetic nature. The ground commenced to show a rugged aspect as I climbed the rise of a hill. Reaching its crest, I became aware that I would have to cross a deep depression if I wished to continue my journey. I hesitated at tackling so strenuous an undertaking. I deliberated whether I would be fit for the return trip. A glance at my watch revealed the fact that the hour was late. My comfortable bed at the village inn seemed to beckon invitingly. As I stood gazing down into the valley, my cheerful spirits began to evaporate. The hollow presented the most dreary and melancholy of views. An air of unnatural quiet brooded over it. Even the last rays of the sun failed to remove this significant impression. It was sad and awful. Rounded rocks covered with lichens and ferns, fallen monarchs, moss-coated, but added to its gloomy distinction. Contiguous to my left, a winding, disused path ran down to the bottom of the vale. It wound and twisted between huge lumps of naked stone that frowned upon its sides. But what chiefly attracted my attention was an enormous elm which grew at the lower end of the track. In its solitary state, it appeared as ruler supreme of the valley. Its branches were poised in sinister fashion over what was apparently a human habitation. Strange that this shack did not arrest the eye at the offset. Somehow, in contrasting the insignificance of the wooden structure with the stark grandeur of the tree, I got the impression of a slave at the foot of the master. A vague restlessness now seized me. A power indefinable was drawing me to the elm. Even as I tried to persuade myself it was a mere curiosity to explore, a sudden fancy to interview a possible tenant of the shack that suggested a descent into the valley, I was nevertheless aware of a sudden loss of willpower. Indefinite anxiety weighed heavily and inexplicably in my mind. I felt cold and miserable. I began to descend. Loose earth slid over my shoes as I stumbled down that path. Every step I made increased my previous depression. Strive as I would to escape it, the feeling never left me. Sometimes I halted and endeavoured to summon sufficient courage to turn back, but it was of no use. A mysterious urge sent me on again, nor did this urge abate until I reached the tree. In a dejected state of mind, I gloomily studied its gnarled trunk and branches. All my past sorrows and regrets commenced to besiege me. The sight of its moist limbs agitated my lacrimatory organs, but with a forced laugh at my foolish fancies, I managed to fight back a strong inclination to weep. I turned my attention to the shack. In appearance, it was the most dilapidated-looking affair I had ever seen. Of ancient age and portraying bad workmanship, it was rapidly approaching the last stages of decay. Damp, unwholesome, and uninviting, its outward aspect was not such as would encourage the exploration of its interior. But I was eager to get away from the morbid influence of the elm, so leaving its dark shadows, I walked to the entrance of the shack and stepped inside, for the door was ajar. The room I entered was small and dirty. The silent interior was filled with a miscellaneous collection of junk. A couch lay near a rusty stove. A woodman's axe occupied a corner. Cans, bottles, and rubbish littered the floor. The walls were covered with strips of wallpaper of floral design, to which dampness had given the likeness of a hideous skin disease. Leaves, woven into peculiar-shaped wreaths, were hung around upon nails. This seemed curious and unaccountable, except on the theory of a child's handiwork. I now noticed that the abode was subdivided by a partition running through the centre. This meant another room. A tightly closed door aroused my inquisitiveness. The light was fading fast. I tried the latch, and to my surprise, I found it opened readily. With a thrill of horror, I paused upon the threshold. An apparition confronted my startled gaze. The figure of a man was standing stock still within the shadows. A sense of utter helplessness prevented me from crying aloud, and I stood rooted to the spot, looking at him in sheer amazement. I felt myself being subjected to a close and searching scrutiny. A full minute seemed to elapse, but he never moved. My tongue quivered in my mouth, vainly striving for articulation. "Speak," I finally managed to say in a croaking voice, making an effort to break the intense silence. He took a quiet step forwards into the waning light from the doorway. He now stood revealed as a thick-set being of the hunter type. Rough, coarse clothes closely fitted a powerful frame. A huge head was set upon massive shoulders. His face was remarkably square-jawed and handsome. Altogether, he presented to the eye a superb specimen of rugged manhood. But it was his eyes that gave me such alarm. For beneath his thick, bushy eyebrows, these orbs shone with a most unnatural glare. Red-rimmed, they seemed to burn with the unquenchable fire of a soul-corroding remorse. My brain felt as though scorched by white-hot flames, for with his stare was communicated to me all the pangs and tortures of a smitten conscience. Again I experienced an overwhelming desire for tears. He scanned my features earnestly, yearningly. Then he spoke. "I thought you were Marian." A feeling of intense relief supplanted my previous melancholy fear. The spell was broken. There was nothing to be afraid of. He had merely mistaken me for someone he was apparently expecting. Marian, a woman's name. What could bring a woman to this god-forsaken shack, I wondered. I suspected a mystery in which I was soon to be involved, and the thought was disquieting. "You are a stranger around here?" he asked in an absent sort of tone. "Well, I need company. God knows it's lonely enough here." And he sighed deeply. With an air of utmost weariness, he flung his stalwart form upon a wooden bed by the wall. He resembled a prisoner in a cell as he lay there, shrouded in darkness. The fact that further conversation seemed to him unnecessary tended to alleviate my mental suffering for the moment. I mumbled an excuse and quit his company for the less disturbing quiet of the outer room. Here I rested, after striking a match and lighting a small piece of candle that I found upon a box. I reclined upon the couch and strove to marshal my chaotic thoughts. They darted through my brain like minnows playing in a brook. This shack. What was I doing here? Of course, I was going back to the inn. Yes, right away. The thoughts recurred again and again, yet I was powerless to make a move. A sense of incapacity and feebleness had stolen over me. My brain was benumbed. I stagnated in a miasma of misery and doubt, was tossed and bewildered in a sea of conflicting emotions. Countless wrongs that I had done in the past surged in upon me. Remorse tugged at my palpitating heart. I would have broken down in sheer despair had I not been overruled by that dominating emotion. Fear. Yes, fear held me in its awful grip. Fear of that remorse-stricken individual behind that partition. There were secrets in his eyes. I dared not guess what. The blackness of night had descended outside. I shivered as I looked through the doorway. For a brief spell, I underwent a reversion of feeling. I even arose and went as far as the door, but as I stared into the black void, an irrepressible tremor pervaded my frame. For there, facing the means of egress, stood the malignant elm, a silent and evil sentinel over me and my companion. What malevolent propensities did it possess? How could I ever regain enough boldness to pass it? One step within its sinister circle, and my pent-up sorrows would gush forth like geysers. I dared not leave. I dared not stay. Then a sound occurred which changed tortures of indecision to final and fearful resignation. The latch clicked, and in glided my acquaintance of the secret face. I saw him as in a mist. His voice reached me as from 1,000 miles distance. Spellbound and palpitating, I listened. Marion. She was a child of nature. Although she was a woman over 30 when I met her. When I say a child of nature, I mean it. She belonged to the woods and flowers. I did not know much of her past. There were rumors. I never cared. I loved her, but she never really returned my affection. I met her one day roaming in the woods. She was a sweet and healthy creature, and as wild as the nature all around her. I wooed her in my rough fashion, but she never seemed to respond. Her soul was wrapped up in the verdure. In a queer way, she made love to the grass, trees, violets. There was an uncanny aspect about her at all times. I never understood her, but I grew to be jealous of the leaves and flowers she handled with such loving care and tenderness. He paused to contemplate the leafy works of simple art upon the walls. The voice, at first so soft and dreamy, suddenly altered as he resumed in tones pregnant with guile. I was enamoured of her physical strength and determined to win her, so I resorted to cunning. In praising her rather plain but charming face, I compared it with the things she loved most. Thus her skin possessed the bronze glow of sunset. Her eyes were as twin violets, her brown hair a garland of the dried wild grass. To further the notion, I pretended an interest in nature that I did not really feel. Queer and uncouth though my clumsy flatteries appeared to be, they had the desired effect. She suddenly swept me into her arms, and the intensity of her love almost frightened me. However, we were married in the village later on. Then she insisted upon living in this shack. The valley held some unreasonable fascination for her. Well, I grudgingly consented to a honeymoon in this desolate hole to please the whim of an unusual woman, but our happiness was short-lived. I shrank perceptibly as his voice became harsh and grating. This worship of nature got on my nerves, even her very stones. One day I upbraided her, and in doing so unwittingly abused some of her favourite flowers. From then on, her manner towards me changed. She hated me, and swore she would return to nature. I never understood her, as I've said before. I never dreamed of evil portent in her apparently meaningless words. With what abject fear and sense of impending horror did I breathlessly await the climax of his story. His intonation, now awe-stricken, chilled my blood. One evening, I found her outside. She was embracing the trunk of that hypnotic elm. "Why? Are you insane?" I cried. "What means this foolishness?" When I attempted to remove her arms, she fell upon me like a fiend. Her curses were terrible. I fought her off. Presently a deadly calm came over her. She looked awful in the moonlight. In vain did I implore her to return indoors. She merely turned from me and resumed her clasp upon the tree. Only once did she favour me with a glance, and such a look of inexorable hatred was contained in it that I left her without further molestation and went to bed. Judge my horror when, upon looking out the window the following morning, I saw her still standing there in the same attitude. My worst fears were realized when I rushed out to look at her. She was dead, in the identical position, and wearing the same ghastly look as on the previous evening. I buried her there. His voice rose as he exclaimed, "I fear that tree. I believe it possesses her soul." That night I slept upon a horror-haunted couch. The long-threatened storm still withheld its violence, but a wind had risen which shook the shack at sudden and alarming intervals. I found a plenitude of mystery in every sound, yet in spite of my highly excited condition, I was aware, to my dismay, that nature was asserting itself within my tired body. Vainly did I endeavour to fight off insidious sleep. The rigidity of my frame, caused by a sense of impending disaster, finally surrendered to unconquerable weariness. Into my uneasy slumber stole phantoms of inconceivable shapes. All wore a look of unutterable gloom, the accumulation of centuries of grief. In their shadowy forms I perceived a something of weird and monstrous peculiarity, half human, half tree. Presently they danced a wild orgy, entwining arms and whirling in a circle. The ring became smaller and smaller. The human elements merged into the fauna, leaving a spinning mass of branches to my amazed and horrified mind. Suddenly the gyrations ceased, and there remained the image of the elm which grew outside the shack. Growing horizontally from its trunk was a grotesquely fashioned limb, strikingly resembling a human arm with hand outstretched. The wiry twigs at the end looked like fingers widespread, as though in readiness for something to grip. And as I watched it, in mesmeric trance, the arm began to stretch and stretch toward me. I was at once seized with an awful terror, while my body remained in a state of suspended animation. The hideous limb reached through the air toward the windows of my room, and the wiry fingers began to scratch at the dirty glass. As if in obedience to an undeniable summons, the catch fell open, and in crept the hand. The sweat rose to my forehead in manifestation of my horror-bound sensation. My heart thumped with appalling loudness. Over my fear-distorted face hovered the dread fingers. Their whip-like talons grazed my flesh. With a shriek I awoke, bathed in perspiration, and trembling in every fibre of my being. It was gone. As if in answer to my cry, there rose a dull, sobbing sound. My face was chalky. My mouth hung open. It was then, just then, that my grip upon my mental faculties relaxed. I was now beside myself with fright. I leapt from the couch and hammered at the door which concealed my partner. "Stop that noise," I said, "or I'll murder you." The wailing noise continued. Goaded to frenzy, I beat a wild tattoo upon the wood and tugged furiously at the latch. The door was locked. "You devil," I said. "I can't stand it. Stop, in the name of God." Then a dreadful fact became manifest to me. The moans I was hearing did not proceed from within the chamber. No, they came from somewhere out in that dark void. Merciful heaven, the tree. A crescendo of wild sobs could now be distinguished above the fret of the rising wind. I found myself grinning in maniacal glee. Where was that axe? Snatching it up with savage eagerness, I rushed into the night. The impetuous fury of a gust nearly swept me off my feet, but I fought my way to the objective. With great vicious blows, I hacked at the malevolent tree. What ghastly sounds were those that issued from its bruised trunk? I exerted my utmost strength in wild swings. I would put an end to all this grief. Come storm, come wind, I would not swerve from my purpose. The cursed elm should die. I glared up exultantly at its thrashing branches, then burst into wild, discordant laughter. Suddenly, an icy chill shot through my shoulder. A human hand had been laid upon it. The uplifted axe remained poised in mid-air. Exerting my will in a mighty effort, I forced myself to look around. It was the odious inmate of the shack. His burning, grief-laden eyes, unimploring yet filled with unspeakable misery, pierced me through and through. Quickly I thrust his hand aside, and then we were locked in each other's hold, a life-and-death struggle. How strong I was, yet he was stronger. If only I could get free to use my weapon, but it had slipped from my grasp during the conflict. To my awful consternation, I noticed his eye upon it as he lay across my prostrate form. Freeing a hand, I caught the axe and threw it a few feet away. He released his giant's grip and jumped up to gain its possession. A terrific blast of wind, a vivid flash of lightning, and crack went the tree. With all its annihilating weight, the elm fell, crashing my opponent's body beneath. Through supernatural glare, shocked with tumultuous roar, stung by 1,000,000 drops of hissing rain, I fled that valley.